Chapter 113. A Lesson in Diligence. The Talents. Matthew 25, 14-30. Chapter Overview. Jesus gives the illustration of the talents. While still with his 4 apostles on the Mount of Olives, Jesus tells them another illustration. A few days earlier, while he was at Jericho, he gave the illustration of the minas to show that the kingdom was yet far off in the future. The illustration he now relates has a number of similar features. It is part of his answer to the question about his presence and the conclusion of the system of things. It highlights that his disciples must be diligent with what he entrusts to them. Jesus begins, "It is just like a man about to travel abroad who summoned his slaves and entrusted his belongings to them." Matthew 25:14. Given that Jesus had already likened himself to a man who traveled abroad to secure kingly power for himself, the apostles could easily see that Jesus is the man being spoken of now. Luke 19:12. Before the man in the illustration travels abroad, he commits to his slaves valuable belongings. During the 3.5 years of his ministry, Jesus focused on preaching the good news of God's kingdom, and he trained his disciples to do this work. Now he is going away, confident that they will carry on doing what he trained them to do. In the illustration, how does the man distribute his belongings? Jesus relates, "He gave 5 talents to one, 2 to another, and 1 to still another, to each according to his own ability, and he went abroad." Matthew 25:15. What will these slaves do with what is entrusted to them? Will they be diligent in using them in their master's interests? Jesus tells the apostles, "Immediately the one who received the 5 talents went and did business with them and gained 5 more. Likewise, the one who received the 2 gained 2 more. But the slave who received just 1 went off and dug in the ground and hid his master's money." Matthew 25:16-18. What will happen when the master returns? After a long time, Jesus continues, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Matthew 25:19. The first 2 did all they could, each according to his own ability. Each slave was diligent, hard-working, and productive with what had been entrusted to him. The one who received 5 talents doubled that, as did the one who received 2 talents. Back then, a worker would have to labor about 19 years to earn the equivalent of 1 talent. The master has the same commendation for each of them. "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful over a few things. I will appoint you over many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Matthew 25:21. It is different, though, with the slave who received 1 talent. He says, "Master, I knew you to be a demanding man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not winnow. So I grew afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours." Matthew 25:24-25. He has not even deposited the money with bankers so as to accumulate at least some profit for his master. He has, in effect, worked against his master's interests. Fittingly, the master designates him a wicked and sluggish slave. What he had is taken away and given to the slave who is willing to apply himself diligently. The master sets out his standard. To everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. Matthew 25, verses 26 and 29. Jesus' disciples have much to think about, even in connection with this one illustration. They can see that what Jesus is entrusting to them, the precious privilege of making disciples, is of great value, and He expects them to be diligent in using this privilege. Jesus does not think that they all must do the same in carrying out the preaching work that He has charged them to do. As illustrated, each should do all that he can according to his own ability. This by no means implies that Jesus will be pleased if one is sluggish and fails to do his best in promoting the Master's belongings. How pleased the apostles must be, though, with the assurance, "To everyone who has, more will be given." Questions for review. In the illustration of the talents, who is like the master, and who are like the slaves? What lessons does Jesus teach His disciples? Chapter 114. Christ in power judges the sheep and the goats. Matthew 25, 31-46. Chapter overview. Jesus gives the illustration of the sheep and the goats. On the Mount of Olives, Jesus has just related the illustrations of the 10 virgins and of the talents. How does He end His answer to the apostles' question regarding the sign of His presence and of the conclusion of the system of things? He does so with a final illustration, one about sheep and goats. Jesus begins by establishing its setting, telling them, "When the Son of Man comes in His glory, and all the angels with Him, then He will sit down on His glorious throne." Matthew 25:31. He leaves no doubt that He, Jesus, is the central figure in this illustration. He often called Himself the Son of Man. Matthew 8:20, 9:6, and 20:18 and 28. When will this illustration find fulfillment? It is when Jesus comes in His glory with the angels and sits down on His glorious throne. He had already spoken about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory and with His angels. When would that be? Immediately after the tribulation. Matthew 24, 29-31. So this illustration is to find fulfillment at Jesus' future coming in glory. What will He then do? Jesus explains, "When the Son of Man comes, all the nations will be gathered before Him, and He will separate people one from another, just as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And He will put the sheep on His right hand, but the goats on His left." Matthew 25, 31-33. Regarding the sheep, separated to the favored side, Jesus says, "Then the King will say to those on His right, 'Come, you who have been blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the founding of the world.'" Matthew 25:34. Why do the sheep receive the King's favor? The King explains, "I became hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you received me hospitably. Naked, and you clothed me. I fell sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you visited me." When these sheep, the righteous ones, ask in what way they did those good things, He answers, "To the extent that you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." Matthew 25, 35, 36, 40, and 46. They do not do these good deeds in heaven, for there are no sick or hungry ones there. These must be deeds done for Christ's brothers on earth. What of the goats, who are put on the left side? Jesus says, "Then the King will say to those on His left, Go away from me, you who have been cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I became hungry, but you gave me nothing to eat. And I was thirsty, but you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, but you did not receive me hospitably. Naked, but you did not clothe me. Sick and in prison, but you did not look after me. Matthew 25:41-43. This judgment is merited because the goats failed to treat Christ's brothers on earth kindly, as they should have done. The apostles learn that this future time of judgment is to have permanent, everlasting consequences. Jesus tells them, "Then the king will say, 'Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did not do it to one of these least ones, you did not do it to me.' These will depart into everlasting cutting off, but the righteous ones into everlasting life." Matthew 25:45-46. Jesus' response to the apostles' question provides much for his followers to think about, helping them to examine their attitudes and deeds. Questions for review. In Jesus' illustration of the sheep and the goats, who is the king? And when is the illustration to be fulfilled? Why will the sheep be judged as meriting Jesus' favor? On what basis will some people be judged as goats? And what future will the sheep and the goats have? Chapter 115. Jesus' final Passover approaches. Matthew 26:1-5 and 14-19. Mark 14:1-2 and 10-16, and Luke 22:1-13. Chapter Overview. Judas Iscariot is paid to betray Jesus. Two apostles prepare for the Passover. Jesus finishes teaching the four apostles on the Mount of Olives, answering their question about his future presence and the conclusion of the system of things. What a busy day Nisan 11 has been. It is perhaps while they are returning to Bethany for the night when Jesus tells the apostles, "You know that 2 days from now the Passover takes place, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be executed on the stake." Matthew 26:2. Jesus apparently spends the next day, Wednesday, quietly with his apostles. On Tuesday, he had rebuked the religious leaders and exposed them publicly. They are seeking to kill him. Hence, he does not openly show himself on Nisan 12, so that nothing will prevent his celebrating the Passover with his apostles after sunset the next evening, as Nisan 14 begins. But the chief priests and the older men of the people are not remaining quiet before the Passover. They gather in the courtyard of the high priest, Caiaphas. Why? They are upset because Jesus has been exposing them. Now they conspire together to seize Jesus by cunning and to kill him. How and when will they do so? They say, "Not at the festival, so that there may not be an uproar among the people." Matthew 26:4-5. They are in fear because Jesus enjoys the favor of many. Meanwhile, the religious leaders receive a visitor. To their surprise, it is one of Jesus' own apostles, Judas Iscariot. Satan has implanted in him the idea of betraying his master. Judas asks them, "What will you give me to betray him to?" Matthew 26:15. Delighted at this, they agree to give him silver money. Luke 22:5. How much? They gladly consent to give him 30 silver pieces. It is significant that the price of a slave is 30 shekels. The religious leaders thus show contempt for Jesus, that he is of little value. Judas now starts looking for a good opportunity to betray him to them without a crowd around. Luke 22:6. Nisan 13 begins at sundown, Wednesday, and this is the 6th and last night Jesus spends in Bethany. The next day, final preparations will need to be made for the Passover. A lamb must be obtained so that it can be slaughtered and roasted whole after Nisan 14 begins. Where will they have the meal? And who will prepare it? Jesus has not provided such details. Thus, Judas cannot pass them on to the chief priests. Probably early Thursday afternoon, Jesus dispatches Peter and John from Bethany, saying, "Go and get the Passover ready for us to eat." They respond, "Where do you want us to get it ready?" Jesus explains, "When you enter into the city, a man carrying an earthenware water jar will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters, and say to the landlord of the house, 'The teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And that man will show you a large, furnished upper room. Get it ready there." Luke 22:8-12. No doubt the landlord is a disciple of Jesus. He may anticipate Jesus' request to use his house for this occasion. When the two apostles get to Jerusalem, they find everything just as Jesus had told them. So they see to it that the lamb is ready and that the other arrangements for the Passover meal are in place to care for the needs of the 13, Jesus and his 12 apostles. Questions for review. What does Jesus apparently do Wednesday, Nisan 12, and why? Why do the religious leaders meet? And why does Judas go to them? Whom does Jesus send into Jerusalem on Thursday? And what do they do? Chapter 116. Teaching humility at the last Passover. Matthew 26:20, Mark 14:17, Luke 22:14-18, and John 13:1-17. Chapter overview. Jesus eats his last Passover with the apostles. He teaches a lesson by washing the apostles' feet. At Jesus' direction, Peter and John have already arrived in Jerusalem to prepare for the Passover. Later, Jesus and the 10.
Hey guys, it's Brent. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe and like this video.